The House is resumed. Tariff, Malaysia Free Trade Agreement Amendment Bill, first reading. Stuart Nash has the call. He has just under 3 minutes, if he wishes. And he doesn't appear to want to seek the call just right at this moment.
Mr. Speaker.
Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The New Zealand-Malaysia Free Trade Agreement is not the first of its kind to come before this House. It follows the China and ASEAN agreements and will be followed by the Gulf states, some Pacific countries, and then India. The fundamentals of these agreements are all the same, and so the debates in the House have a certain quality of déjà vu. The debate over trade is simply part of the debate over the global economy. The difference between national and Labour orthodoxy on the one hand and the Green alternative on the other is, in the most fundamental way, a difference in economic philosophy. We have to revisit first principles, as it were. Essentially, National and Labour embrace traditional neoclassical economics. The Greens adopt ecological economics. The difference is qualitative. The government's case for free trade rests on two arguments: short-term morality and efficiency. The Greens' case for sustainable trade rests on two arguments: long-term morality and scale. The moral argument, as propounded by Trade Minister Grosser, is the following. The global population is set to grow from 6 to 8 billion by 2030, and food demand will increase by 50%. New Zealand has an obligation to feed that expanding and urbanising population. That moral obligation is accompanied by a financial interest in increasing our export income. So morality sanctions us to engage in production and trade, and to do so at optimal efficiency. The global economy is to grow through productivity specialisation, reflecting the theory of comparative trade advantage. The combined economic output is increased, and all countries stand to gain to some extent, even if some gain more than others. So we are all better off, and New Zealand in particular combines economic wealth with moral satisfaction. With a population of 4 million, we feed some 18 million people around the world already. With improved productivity, we could feed more. Specialisation, however, means that our land, financial capital and labour force will be required to realign from the less to the more productive sectors. But this can be done through time-bound, phased-out regimes. That worldview is most recently expressed in Mr. Grosser's foreword to UNCTAD's 2010 Trade and Environment Review. All countries, Mr. Grosser wrote, have a common interest in food security, removing impediments to trade, and reducing global GHG emissions. Increased economic wealth would improve the common ability of countries over time to contribute to global action on climate change. Note the phrase, over time. The Minister believes that the world, with New Zealand punching above its weight as a fast follower, has the luxury of time as it slopes off into the 21st century. Not our problem to determine the pace of change. Mr. Speaker, the Green worldview is different. It has to do with sustainability, and it has a different conception of both the magnitude of the problem and the urgency of its resolution. The carrying capacity of the planet, based on current technology, is less than 8 billion. In fact, it is less than today's 6 billion. Precisely what figure the optimal population is depends on the level of material consumption for humanity as a whole. If we all live Western lifestyles, we need 6 planets. Even at the average global level of consumption today, we have an ecological overshoot of some 30%. So with our current technology and our current lifestyle, we are simply overpopulated on the planet. If we cannot bring ourselves to accept this unpalatable fact, then alternatively we have to acknowledge that the global economy is breaching the planet's ecological limits. In light of this, New Zealand's moral obligation is not so straightforward. The national Labour position is not to query the greater human numbers, simply feed them and make a dollar. The Green position is to search for optimality of scale. That is a long-term moral imperative, rather than a short-term moral choice. Mr. Key and Mr. Goff toss the phrase sustainable development around through a vague intuition that it is a modern political good. but they do not understand its true meaning, and they do not comprehend its implications for macroeconomic management or trade policy. British scientist James Lovelock contends the planet's carrying capacity is closer to 1 billion, that we may not reach 8 billion, and that the population will probably decline towards that much lower figure. Whether he is accurate or not with the figure, he is correct within an order of magnitude. The national Labour governments are not. Does the moral obligation for New Zealand exports hold for a global population of 20 billion? British governmental advisor John Beddington warns of a perfect storm around 2030 when resource depletion, climate stress, population numbers, lifestyle aspirations and energy constraints roil the global economy and inflame the body politic. Whether he is accurate in his time prediction, he is correct about the prognostication. So where does this leave global trade policy? Globalised free trade is the manifestation of the problem of the globalised economy. The case for free trade rests on the assumption that trade is voluntary. Both parties must be better off than before the voluntary act. When trade is based on the absolute advantage enjoyed by the countries for the commodities in question, this is self-evident. But the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage still justifies trade, even when a country may have absolute advantage in all goods. The theory is that the combined production of all countries trading is greater than if they produced separately, and that each country stands to gain individually, even if not to the same extent. Only last week, the WTO chief, Pascal Lamy, dismissed any challenge to the notion that open trade brings overall societal benefit. Contested policy, he said, provides a fertile field for the growth of urban legend and falsely premised ideas with popular appeal. He identified what he saw as 6 fallacies or economic myths and sought to refute them. Time does not permit me to examine each one here. The benefits of trade, which Mr. Lamy identified as economic well-being and political harmony, will only be realised, he contended, if the overall policy context is right. How right he was. Mr. Lamy called for a public debate, so the Greens' response is to identify the mistakes in his thinking. There are 6 fallacies in the Ricardo-Lamy-Grosser theory of free trade, and they are as follows. 1. The extra combined production from free trade, in fact, cannot be achieved without extra resources. There is the increase in the rate of depletion in the natural resource base from which the product is made. What trade economists mean when they say no extra resources is simply no additional labour or financial capital, because neoclassical economics omits natural capital in its theory. 2. The extra transport costs associated with free trade are not included. International transport is energy intensive, often subsidised, and its external costs are omitted from its pricing. Sea trade emits 0.8 billion tonnes of CO2, 3% of all anthropogenic emissions, and this is expected to triple by 2050. The same is expected of aviation and surface freight. 3. Free trade assumes the economic cost of specialisation to be negligible, but it ignores the social cost. It requires retraining and perhaps physical relocation. That is a loss in human welfare. The invisible hand has narrowed the freedom to choose. 4. FTOs have a withdrawal clause, and if the trade becomes too disadvantageous, New Zealand can theoretically opt out. But that assumes that specialisation is reversible. Is a furniture maker to return to the Wairarapa after a brief stint as a share milker in Canterbury, simply because things didn't work out? 5. The specialisation results in a narrow range of sectoral products, country by country. That makes each country vulnerable to the vagaries of the global economy. When cute varieties of ice cream and salted crackers pass in the night across the Tasman in the name of choice and carbon emission, that is simply daft. 6. Ricardo's free trade theory was confined to trade and goods alone. The 2 productive factors, labour and capital, remain confined within national boundaries. Only commodities crossed national frontiers. Today's globalisation bequeaths far greater mobility in financial